Matthew 25, verses 1 to 13. At that time the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins, who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 of them were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps, but did not take any oil with them. The wise ones, however, took oil in jars along with their lamps. The bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight the cry rang out, "Here's the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Then all the virgins woke up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, our lamps are going out." "No," they replied, "there may not be enough for both us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves." But while they were on their way to buy the oil, the bridegroom arrived. The virgins who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later the others also came. "Lord, Lord," they said, "open the door for us." But he replied, "Truly, I tell you, I don't know you. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour."
The Gospel reading that Andrea has just shared with us introduces us to yet another of the stories or the parables of Jesus. And if you've been following these services or sermons week by week, you'll know that I've not only been keen for us to learn something from what each of them has to say in their own right, but also to recognise something of the unfolding plot and context of Matthew's Gospel, which is where, of course, they're all taken from. Matthew is an interesting Gospel because from the outset he offers us a kind of different perspective on things. You know, he begins with a first century version of "Who do you think you are?" really, as he traces the ancestry of Jesus way back into the history of God's people. But having rooted him in that tradition, he then picks out from the birth narratives those things that kind of happen outside of the conventions of the day. Even the conventions of science, as Mary is described as a virgin, or the social conventions, as Joseph is persuaded in a dream not to desert Mary as tradition would usually require, but to make her his wife. And then arrived these visitors from the east, outsiders from another country, and from what we can gather, even another religious tradition. And they're the ones who proclaim Jesus as King and God and Messiah. But then the family are forced to flee to Egypt because the nation that should have provided welcome and refuge for the newborn Messiah instead becomes a place of threat and violence. And so it's Egypt which becomes the place of safety. And so the narrative that we then see played out 30 years or so later, when Jesus is an adult, when the temple authorities begin to oppose and reject him, is very much an echo of those earlier stories that come at the beginning of the Gospel. And in between, we've been offered glimpses into just who this Jesus is. We've been looking at the teaching of Jesus, particularly through what we call the Sermon on the Mount, where we're introduced to many of those key statements that still echo through our faith narratives. We're invited to explore the identity of Jesus as the disciples wrestle with what to make of this man who can miraculously feed a hungry crowd, or command a storm to be still, or walk across the surface of a lake to meet them in a boat. And then we're introduced to the kingdom of Jesus, or as it's often described, the kingdom of heaven. What it means to live as a member of the Jesus community. And then, of course, as they enter the temple, we have this series of confrontations and parables that are a very real challenge to the authorities of the day. And after several altercations with the scribes and the Pharisees and the Herodians, they go away. They leave the scene. They will be back, of course, with their lynch mobs and their execution parties, but for now they've left the stage. And Jesus embarks on another series of stories that begin to look to the future. And what is interesting is that these follow a chapter in chapter 24, where he particularly looks forward to a time when the temple and all these trappings of the nation will pretty much have been laid waste. So these are the kind of what then parables. And in many respects, Having been taken on this journey to explore the teaching and the identity and the implications of following Jesus, having recognized that to follow Jesus is not a matter of simply belonging to the traditional religious interest groups or having the right ethnic identity, and indeed discovering that following Jesus may place us in serious conflict with such groups, we could say that we are now confronted with a very simple question. Well, so what? How are you going to respond to all of this? And one of the ways that we are confronted with that question is through this story of what is often called the wise and the foolish virgins. Now, from what we can gather, the setting for this story is pretty much the cultural practices of the day. When there was a community wedding, the bridegroom would be brought to the ceremony amidst a procession of teenage girls, each carrying a lamp and sort of delivering him to probably one of their friends. I mean, let's remember these were pretty close-knit communities where everyone would have known everyone. So, and before you start thinking that all sounds a bit quaint and old-fashioned, let's not forget that 2,000 years or so later, we do exactly the same with the lights on our mobile phones when we're at music concerts and the like. But in this story, the bridegroom is delayed, and they've got their lamps lit, and they wait, and they wait, and they wait, as one by one their lamps run out of oil, and then he turns up. And when he does, some are able to relight their lamps because they brought spare oil. So the ones without oil aren't much use and end up missing out on their big moment. Now, before we get into too much detail on this story, let's remember again that Jesus often takes ordinary examples from everyday life and just uses them to illustrate important points in his own teaching. So again, I would say that I'm not sure that we need to find meaning in every minute detail of this story. You know, I can remember having a long discussion with someone on one occasion about why those who had oil hadn't just shared it and why they didn't just put half as much oil in every lamp and whether this meant it must have been a long walk. And in the end, I just kind of said to him, you know, because if they'd shared their oil, then Jesus wouldn't have been able to make his point, would he? It was just a story, and the point that Jesus was trying to make was not to make sure we always carry around our phone chargers or a spare battery for our torches, but to be ready for when he comes. Now, as I said earlier, the big narrative of Matthew's gospel has taken another turn here. And again, we can see how Matthew kind of carries the narrative from the previous bit and recasts it in the next. So what of all these debates and controversies and falling out with the Pharisees and the scribes and the Herodians that we've read about in the previous chapters all been about? Well, basically, they weren't ready. They were just like the young women in this story. They had all the trappings and the finery. They were convinced that they had a role and a place in God's big narrative. But at the crucial moment when God turned up, they weren't ready. Now, in their case, that wasn't because they didn't have oil for their lamps or needed to go out and buy some and then discover that Jesus had moved on before they got back. They weren't ready because they weren't open. They'd become so blinded by their own expectations and ideas that they simply didn't recognize that Jesus was the bridegroom. And if we follow the symbolism of this story, when he came, they didn't have what was needed. But Jesus now begins to offer that narrative to those who would be his followers. And I would say, therefore, he had you and me in mind here, just as much as any of the people who were standing in front of him in the temple square when he first told this story. Because Jesus knew what was going to happen. And as we read the gospel in hindsight, we recognize the significance of those temple authorities all disappearing from the scene. They've gone off to plan his end. And Jesus knows that he's going to die. But he knows that he's going to rise again and ascend into heaven. And he knows he's going to return. And he holds this situation in front of us and basically asks us the simple question, are you ready? Are you ready for when I come again? Or are you in danger of making the same mistake that you're seeing being made in the events that are happening now? And being ready will have all kinds of different implications for us. But if you want to find a simple story of what I think Jesus is saying here, and through the parables that he shares alongside it, it's simply this: live in the here and now, in the anticipation of the coming of Jesus. And there is an element of surprise in all of these stories. This one, the surprise comes not so much because the bridegroom turns up. They were all expecting that. But he takes longer than they expected, and as time went on, some of them became less and less ready. But the bridegroom was going to come, and the bridegroom did turn up. And I hope that you might allow me to pause for a moment and to reflect on what this story particularly might say to us on this Remembrance Sunday. On a day like today, we cannot escape the reality of our human mortality. We've been reminded of that through stories of people like Jeffrey Studdert Kennedy in the First World War, but also stories from people like Mabel working on the front line of our NHS services. And through that, we've been reminded of the selfless sacrifice of many who have spent themselves in the service of others, even to the point of laying down their own lives. And we pause to remember, not because we want to somehow glorify war, but because we abhor it. And we lament that as a human race, we still resort to organised violence against one another. That doesn't diminish those acts of sacrifice. But we should always regret that cost being required. And as I think about that, from the perspective of this particular story, we might say that many of the lives that we have remembered today would be those for whom the bridegroom came earlier than expected, not later. And that's why I would argue that we need to engage with these stories, not by analysing their minutest detail, but by hearing the overarching narrative that Jesus is seeking to put across. And you can see how poignant this all is. Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down their life for their friends. That's a phrase that has particular poignancy on a day like today. But Jesus didn't just say that, he did it. And he did it because he recognized that this was the way to redeem humanity, to offer us that gift of eternity that God so longs for us to share. Human life is a precious and sacred thing. That's what today, and a day like today, is all about. So precious and so sacred that God was prepared to offer himself as Jesus to reclaim it for eternity. And Jesus says, be ready for when I come, however and whenever I come, because you simply do not know when that will be. But what does it mean to be ready? It's easy to say we need to be ready, but what does it mean for us in the here and now? Well, as I've already observed, I sense that it means more than making sure that we keep our phones charged and a spare battery pack in our handbags, or whatever the 21st century equivalent may be of having oil in our lamps. But let me offer to you three things that I think we might hear echoed in this story. And the first of those, I would suggest, is simply Jesus saying to us, hang on in there. Don't give up. The bridegroom is delayed. And I sense that one of the reasons that this story made it into Matthew's Gospel is that he was writing a generation or so after the death of Jesus. And there were many in the early church who were expecting Jesus to come again in a matter of years, if not months. And he was taking longer than they expected. And I also hear echoes here of that parable from a much earlier chapter in Matthew's Gospel about seed that springs up and then withers, or that gets choked or swallowed up by birds, standing in contrast with that takes longer but eventually grows to fruition. And again, we hear something of the longevity of the kingdom in all of this. And you know, if there's one thing that we're all having to learn at the moment, it's to be patient and to wait. And no one is pretending that that's easy. But perhaps the lessons that we're having to learn through lockdown can inform our faith, or for that matter, the narratives of our faith can help us through lockdown. You're called to be a follower of Jesus whatever the circumstances. You're called to act and live as a follower of Jesus, whether things are working out as you expect them to or whether they're not. For the girls at this wedding, that meant having enough oil to see them through the wait. For the first readers of the gospel, it meant recognizing that Jesus may not return in their lifetimes. And if you want a glimpse at another of our lectionary readings today, you can see that the Apostle Paul offers the same kind of encouragement to the believers in Thessalonica in chapter 4 of his letter to the Thessalonians. And if we read from verse 13, this is what it says. We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about those who have died, so that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have died. In other words, Paul is saying to those early believers, hang on in there. Death is not the end. Which again is both dealing with the immediate issue of what happens to Christian believers who die, but also making that broader point. So that's the first thing I think we can learn as we just look at this story. Let's recognize that we're in this for the long haul. And the second aspect of readiness that I think we can draw from this story would be for me to make sure that we get our priorities right. You know, I think Jesus divides those two women into two equal groups of 5 to deliberately make the point of contrast. In so many ways, the 10 were identical. I don't know, but if it was a wedding, just like weddings today, they may well have been wearing the same clothes, or at least flowers or sashes that were the same, or something that kind of emphasized their belonging together as a whole. We may even imagine they all had identical lamps. They had an awful lot more in common than what differentiated them. But they had a job to do, to create a lamplit procession. And when the crucial moment came, they may have all had the trappings and all the extras. They may have all even had their lamps. But 5 of them had no flame because they had no oil. And because they had no oil, they had no place in the procession and in the wedding banquet. And you could almost hear that famous quote from Shakespeare's Richard III here, you know, a horse, buy kingdom for a horse, oil, oil, anything for oil. And again, you can hear the echoes of all the arguments and controversies that have immediately preceded this story, with those great debates with the religious leaders of the day. Because they too had produced all the trappings. They had their temple, they had their festivals, complete with souvenir stalls and human cash dispensers. But they'd lost the vital ingredient. This was supposed to be a house of prayer, is the way Jesus had put it at the beginning of the week. But let's not lose sight of the context in the textual narrative here. This is primarily not a word to all those temple authorities. They've already left the building. It's a word to you and to me. And quite simply, the oil in our lamp, so to speak, that Jesus is speaking of here could be expressed as saying, I'm not inviting you to be religious. I'm not asking you to dress in the right clothes or to accumulate all the right equipment. I'm not even really asking you at the end of the day to hang around with the right people, because half of them have got it wrong here. I'm asking you to keep hold of the right ingredient, which quite simply is about understanding who Jesus is and accepting the reality and living in relationship with him. That's the oil that we need in our lamps, so to speak. And that kind of leads me to the third element that I want to draw from this story. You know, it is easy, not that difficult, to look at this story and think that actually those young women got a pretty raw deal. I mean, after all, it wasn't their fault that the bridegroom turned up late. And it feels pretty heartless that they then have the door quite literally shut in their faces. Well, like I said, I'm not sure that we necessarily need to read meaning into every last detail. But as I pondered on that myself, I was reminded that this is not the only wedding feast that is going on in these chapters. Just a few paragraphs earlier in Matthew chapter 22, Jesus told another story about a wedding banquet arranged by a king for his son. And this one ended up being attended by all kinds of unexpected people, because those who were first invited were frankly too busy with other things to bother coming. And again, we might recognise that this was very much aimed at the religious authorities of the day, but the narrative is now switching its spotlight to us. So if we're going to think about the coming of Jesus and the invitation of Jesus in the language of wedding celebrations, it doesn't seem unreasonable to look at the two of these together and in the light of each other. So inside that wedding banquet were unexpected guests, and those women were not shut out because there was no invitation, but because they could no longer fulfill their specific role. And I hope that I'm not asking too much of the story to suggest that Jesus here is introducing us to quite a big theological issue. The society into which Jesus was speaking, the society into which Matthew reminds us Jesus was born, was pretty much defined by the law. Follow God's rules, follow them to the letter, get everything absolutely right and you're in. But of course, no one is perfect. And many of the later New Testament writers, particularly the Apostle Paul, wrestle with this reality. And what they say is it's not that the law is obsolete, but it demands an adherence that we just cannot accomplish. And we need the law so that we can recognize that. But in recognizing that, we also then recognize our need for Jesus, who offers us grace, mercy, and forgiveness. So while we may feel that these young women were particularly hard done by, let's remember it was just a story told to illustrate a point. But what they say to us is, if you want to reach God's kingdom through role and function, and by having all the I's dotted and all the T's crossed, by being in the lamp procession, so to speak, then recognize what a difficult route that is. But this is a wedding feast to which an open and undeserved invitation has already been offered. And being ready can be as simple as simply accepting that offer. Well, if there is one thing that has dominated our landscape over the last year or so, it's about being ready for the unexpected. And I suspect that there'll be a few twists and turns yet before we fully navigate our way through what are probably the most unexpected set of circumstances that we have faced in our lifetimes. But as Mabel's reminded us, these times will pass. But perhaps one of the lessons that we could all do with carrying forward from them is to be a people who are ready, as we're reminded in this story. Now, I suspect that as a result of this pandemic, there will be warehouses full of PPE and ventilators. There'll be all kinds of response plans written to make sure that we are better prepared if anything like this ever happens again. And I suspect that quite a few of us might well just keep an odd couple of tins of meat or packets of loo rolls in the cupboard somewhere just in case. But the narratives of our faith, and particularly these parables of Jesus, speak about another kind of readiness. That's the one we've been looking at today. A readiness that I would dare to argue is of even greater significance than anything we have witnessed or aspired to in recent days. I will come again, says Jesus. And in a few weeks' time, the season of Advent will begin, when we're particularly reminded of that call to live our lives in a state of readiness for that. And as one of the many stories that Jesus offers to help us live this out, this one reminds us of those three things. We're in this for the long haul, so hang on in there as a people of faith. We need to recognize what really matters and to live life in authentic relationship with the living Jesus, not just a passing interest in religion. And we are invited to be part of God's eternal community. We don't need to earn our place there. We don't need to belong to the right crew. We just need to accept God's invitation. So on this Remembrance Sunday, when we recognise how precious but also how fragile human life can be, when we give thanks for the lives of those who followed Christ's example of selfless service, let's make our response one of determining to live lives in readiness for whenever and however Christ may come or call.